Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage President of Signal and leading voice on AI, power, and tech accountability, Meredith Whittaker. Moderate session,
really nice
expert
to be here.
in AI and digital reputation, Matteo Flora.
I'm going to double up.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. No, just in case.
Didn't notice they mic'd you beforehand.
They did mic me beforehand, but just in case, we're well covered.
Welcome.
It's really nice to be here.
Oh, it's
Thank
nice
you.
to have you here. I've been exciting all the week just for the opportunity of asking you a couple of questions.
Well, I have to say one of the conversations I had on the very long drive up from Rome was how good the questions were and how intelligent the framing was.
Yeah.
Thank you all, but it was, my team remarked on it, I remarked on it, I was like, who is behind this? This is really thoughtful, so it's a pleasure to be here for many reasons, but I really appreciate that.
Okay. I'm taking a little bit of an eye to the clock, and that's it.
My notes as a tech executive.
Yeah, of course. So let's start from the elephant in the room.
Let's do it.
The elephant in the room is the title itself of our meeting. That is, whoever writes the code dictates the rules. So I've heard you talking a lot about this. We briefly met in Chaos Communication Camp a couple of times. I'm one of the guys from Hermes, so Global X, etc. I'm one of the founders.
We love what you do.
And I know that it's something that is deep in your heart, but I like the way you talk about that. You're insightful, you're knowledgeable, and AI isn't really a magic cloud. It isn't. It's just code that is deployed on a scale, on a level that we have seldom seen before. So what is the new kind of scare that technology such as AI is bringing to the code itself? Because code beforehand was a bunch of bros in the United States doing technology. Right now we have the same bunch of guys, and we have artificial intelligence deploying things with biases, and I'm scared.
Yeah. Well, I think your fear is well rooted, and I think I actually would like to explode this concept even behind code, right? Because of code has to run on compilers. It has to be compiled by compilers. These systems have to run on hardware infrastructure. Those hardware infrastructures have to be powered by our electricity grid. And the thing that the code is sort of built on requires a huge amount of data, which in order to have at the scale we're talking about, when we're talking about these large-scale AI systems, effectively require you to have access to massive platforms. So either you scrape the web, which is sort of a game that has run its course. There's sort of no more new data to scrape. Or you own something like Facebook or Amazon Marketplace or another place where people deposit certain types of data. And then wrapped around all of that, because what is new are the scale of these things. What is new is the consumer market for them. But code has existed since, we can say Babbage, or we can go before Babbage in the mid 18th century to look at accounting practices as code. Really, we can historicize this anywhere we want. Data has existed, the sort of creation of fungible numbers about things and people for administrative purposes. But what I think is new right now, or newly revived with a real force in our world, is the narrative wrapped around that. This idea that you put all these things together, you train a large-scale model on all of this data, and you deploy that, and that becomes intelligence. And that intelligence is not only very good, it is in some tellings of this story superhuman. It is in some tellings of this story better than us. It is in some tellings of this story that topple over into the theological, a new godhead that we need to shut up and worship. And so when you wrap that story which we can think about as code, but that story is really important to what we're doing here. When you wrap that around the fact that right now only a handful of companies in the world, publicly traded companies governed by shareholder incentives, have all of those resources, and that they're telling a story about effectively being these administrative godheads. That they're telling a story about having so much intelligence that we need to step aside whatever institution or government or state we are affiliated with and allow them access to the nervous system of our institutions, our politics, our lives, our access to resources, our access to each other. I think we do need to be afraid, and we do need to look at the asymmetry between who gets to write the code, who gets to own the infrastructure, who has enough lobbyists to bully the small town into giving them premier access to the energy grid, who has the ability to collect and create this data via platforms, who has access to cloud servers that span the world to create more and more of that, who has a business model that can cross-subsidize all of this. And I think the main thing we need to do is not ask for access to the code so we have equal footing, but to actually start dismantling and questioning this narrative. Who is this narrative serving? Whose incentives is it serving? And who is an AI user? And who is AI being used on?
Yeah, but because we are quite accustomed, I don't say it's fair, but we are quite accustomed in having an AI bropoly, okay, a monopoly.
Yeah.
But we have been quite accustomed to the technology oligopoly right now. But right now, AI is, in my point of view, is far more pervasive because it has consumerized the possibility of each and every single, even small company to run LLMs and create any kind of solutions. Solutions that are thought to be biasless and superhuman in any point. But technically speaking, we are just referring to models created by a very small bunch of philosophies and companies, and we are seeing that propagating in a scale I've seldom seen before.
Yeah. I'm in violent agreement here, and I think one of the things that isn't common sense, in part because the narrative we get is written by these companies largely and their marketing departments, not written by us because we don't have access to a lot of this stuff, to be very real about that. One of the narratives here is that there is a booming innovation ecosystem. There are many people experimenting with AI. There is a startup ecosystem. You hear this even from European politicians sometimes. Yeah. But when you scratch under the surface, that's really not accurate if we're going to be responsible with these terms. So many of the hottest AI startups are simply white labeling a GPT or a Claude API. That's
GPT
most
wrappers.
of them. Yeah. And then GPT, Microsoft will look at that and be like, that's a cool product, and then build the same one, right? And this is a huge issue. This has been an issue with Amazon. This is an issue with a lot of these providers. And even when you have a Mistral in France, or an Alpha Aleph in Germany, which is a little bit different, but let's look at Mistral. And they have gotten the funding, they've gotten access to the GPUs by getting sort of sweetheart deals from Amazon and other cloud providers, because again, that's kind of how you get that. They've built large models, they've open sourced them, they have a business model of sort of client services, so they help implement those, but otherwise, how do you make money? You still have to go through these big companies for your path to market. So that was one of the first things out the gate for Mistral, was licensing that model through Amazon Cloud APIs, Microsoft Cloud APIs, because that's how people access them, either through these cloud APIs, because you're not going to run your own servers. You can't for this, especially the level of compute required. You can't. No. Or you already own a platform, so you're Meta, and you integrate these things into your platform to, let's be real, help with engagement and ad optimization in one way or another. So the same business model is just sort of sprinkled through with AI. And again, that tracks back on the market access side to these same handful of companies, we can say 5 companies in the US context divided differently, and then companies in China, because for historic reasons, China has a self-contained market that was large enough to support an endemic tech ecosystem and was very staunch about not allowing US incumbents access, which no other region in the world was able to accomplish. So.
And behind coders, by the way, there is a flourishing other part of workers working for AI, that is the labelers.
The labelers. And the reinforcement
and
learning with human feedback, like nannies, I would say, like babysitters.
And there are a bunch of them in several specific parts of the world. And is that, I don't know, a way of creating more balance, more bias-less artificial intelligence, having so many people talking with artificial intelligence? Yeah. I'm sarcastic.
I love that you couldn't keep a straight face.
I'm sarcastic.
Yeah, no, and you're right to be. Yeah, I mean, isn't that democracy that so many people around the world get to participate in the creation of AI by...
I've been told that quite a few times by politicians, with a serious face.
I mean, there's a handful of entry-level courses in university I would love to introduce them to. However, of course, it's not democracy. It's traditional neo-colonialist labor politics, in which a lot of the grunt work is outsourced largely to workers in the majority world. So you're looking at the Philippines, a number of African countries, South American countries, where it's possible to pay people very little for rote work. And this work is, how many people here are familiar with data labeling for AI? I don't want to be presumptuous because, again, it's part of the narrative that doesn't seep out into the narrative of, the AI godhead. It's a little inconvenient to have to credit thousands and thousands of workers as the source of the thing you're selling as the new god, right? Little uncomfortable. But effectively, how does AI know what it knows? It knows it from data, but how does it know what's in the data, right? If it gets a bunch of bits and bytes, spewed in via some, SQL database, how does it know what those bits and bytes mean? It can say, this clump of bits and bytes, is sort of similar to this other clump of bits and bytes, and this other clump was in my normal distribution, and that's how I recognize it, but doesn't know what that is without a human saying, this clump is a cat, right? And now I know that the label cat is sort of representative of this configuration. But of course, that's highly biased as well, because in different cultural contexts, different, what are more abstract terms? What is a sad face? What is a happy face across cultures that may express differently, may emote differently, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I used to see at Google, Frank, and this is a little bit of inside information, these thick training decks that would be sent from New York and Mountain View, from the machine learning research teams, to the labelers in India and Pakistan. And they were focused on trying to educate the workers in Western norms, right? Around gender, around sexuality, around, many other things that you wouldn't think of, because these were considered correct and the way that data needed to be labeled to produce the type of outputs that you could sell or integrate. And these were giant decks, 70, 200, slides that were trying to kind of say, hey, this is the consciousness you need to apply to creating this data. And without this data, AI doesn't work. That is literally the intelligence, is the product of these labels applied by very low-paid workers, but there's enough of them, it's still very expensive, to inform the AI system as to how to produce an understanding about the normal distribution, what the data in the normal distribution that it's trained on. And then there's this other process whereby, let's be real, the internet is a really gross place. A lot of people do really nasty things, and when you're talking about the scale of data you need to train these models, you can't check every image, every utterance, right? It's just all the garbage, poof, in. And that produces some really garbagey results that aren't safe for work, aren't safe to sell to your corporate clients, aren't safe to sell to your government clients. So you have a process called reinforcement learning with human feedback, which is it's like a technical sounding brand, which just means that a human is presented with a stack of garbage, like the most racist, gnarly, offensive, like upsetting content, and it feeds it into the system and it says no. And the system learns what's a no. But a human is the buffer there. They have to look at it, and then when the system produces a result that is like too offensive, too disgusting, they have to say no. And they do that over and over and over and over, and over again. Very, 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 very expensive. And that's the only way you get a model that is actually sort of suitable for like, to bring home to your parents, let's say. But again, that's a huge amount of human labor. None of this would work full stop without that.
Yeah, and there are a little bit of artifacts into that too. I can remember Lion 5 billion that contained the pedophile material by itself. So,
which is just illegal. I mean, any of you know work in tech, like the first training anyone gets is like, do not touch it, do not store it, forward it immediately to legal.
Burn it with fire.
Burn the building down. And so what we're talking about is a massive number of models trained on a public data set that was too big to check for this stuff, in which, CSAM, child sexual abuse material was ultimately discovered.
I got several questions about Signal, obviously.
Yeah, I love talking about Signal.
Before that,
we're the opposite of this.
Okay, we have a diagnosis that is, okay, that can't function this way. But the thing I love about you is that every single time in your life you've found a problem, you've strived very hard to find a solution. So in this peculiar case, I'm considering the AI Now Institute.
Yeah.
So can you tell me a little bit about how the AI Now Institute wants to try to solve this problem? Use the verb you most like.
Yeah. Well, I think, first, I was a co-founder of the AI Now Institute in 2016. So it was, this is kind of old, but also pretty new. And but right now it's being led by Amba Kok and Sarah Myers-West, who are, it's never been stronger. And I want to credit them with the work that is going on. They just launched an incredible new report looking at power asymmetries and concentration of power and some of these issues in AI. And I think, there are many ways to answer that question. And I think, none of my work has ever been a totalizing solution, right? It's where do I have a shovel and where can I dig? And that's going to be the answer for me, not necessarily the answer for everyone else. And we need a lot of people digging. This is not a one-man band. And so with AI Now, the project there is really to look under the surface of a lot of these claims and understand where is this a political or social or economic issue that needs to be solved with levers on that side of the fence, and where is this a technical issue? So, for example, if you're talking about AI and education, right? Is AI actually going to benefit, if we look at the budget for your education department, is it going to help children more to subsidize school lunches and after-school care and a large green field they can play on, for instance, or to improve education AI so that they have bots that do more things in the classroom? Now, I'm not saying there aren't different ways to answer that question, but one of the issues with this narrative and with the idea of inevitability that is being pushed around, this is innovation, this is scientific progress, and kind of erases the self-interest of the people and institutions selling it, is that we don't even get to answer that question. We don't even get to say, like, if our goal were to love and support our children, what would we do? Well, maybe they need to eat before they have a bot, right? Maybe the bot can be really helpful with certain things, and we don't want to discount that as just sort of reflexively. But again, if we are centering the children we want to care for. Similarly in healthcare, if we're centering patients, in the US our healthcare system is disaster. It's an embarrassing disaster. But, and so there's you pay for care and there's, barely get it and it's very complicated. But if we cared about patients, would we be investing in AI that may not in the US be accessible to patients, or would we be thinking about preventative medicine or a 4-day work week? Or, what does the research actually tell us if our goal were the purported goal of, human well-being? And then how do we honestly answer that? And how do we equip the people who are most likely to be harmed by these systems, people at the margins, people who are often not listened to in these debates, workers, educators, children, with information that can help them push back when they are feeling steamrolled by a lot of the technical inevitability and these narratives that are often pushed into the environments where they need to live and thrive.
Thank you so much. So I don't really like asking personal questions because technically speaking, because
I can avoid them. So.
I'm autistic, so I do not have this kind of thing. But there is something that I really loved about you, looking at your story and seeing how you moved. That it's full of people protesting. That all the world is full of people protesting whatever. Yeah. There is a scarce minority of people that instead of just protesting, start to build something. Take the shower, as you told me just a couple of minutes ago. Can you tell us a little bit about what's behind this? Because I find it fascinating and I love this kind of... it's still protesting, technically speaking, but it's protesting with code and with things, with making stuff. Yeah.
I mean, you're a CCC person. Yep. There's a nucleus of people who do think this way, right? It's, like I have a shovel, where do I dig? To build the world that's going to make this fun and vibrant and ensure that our one magical life on this strange planet is actually worthwhile. And I think it's, to me, protesting and building toward a better world they're the same thing. They're just different sides, right? You have to say, both. Yes, this is what we want. And no, not that. That's getting in the way of it. And those things are just different ways of sort of framing that sentence. But it's, I think the idea that critique is somehow negative is, it's just a very shallow framing that benefits the status quo, right? Like, critique is an act of love. If you're, if it's honest, right? It's like, this isn't working. Let's make it work. Let's create the thing that benefits us all. Let's not have the boring, stale, harmful version. Let's have the fun, vibrant version, and let's build that. And I don't think they're separable in the sort of praxis that I am invested in. And it's, again, I don't think when people are kind of like, oh, that's so dark, that's so I'm like, no, it's actually it's the way you get through to something that is genuinely meaningful, is to understand what needs to change and then figure out the creative process of changing it.
Yeah, I've got a bunch of friends breaking things to make them better.
Yeah. My people.
So let's shift on Signal itself. Because Signal is part of this behavior. So there is something fundamentally broken. Then in my point of view is more the business model about messaging than not the technology itself. Let's fix it. It's a challenge. I saw you last week, I think, at the American Library in Paris. In a pod. I saw you online on a podcast, and you were quite marvelous into explaining that. You told in that podcast that Signal had to fight in an environment in which the business model of the industry is exactly the opposite of what Signal is trying to achieve. Can you talk a little bit to then maybe they know that Signal is a non-profit organization and the challenges behind this thing?
Yeah, absolutely. And Signal is a nonprofit, which is really, we're one of one in tech. In tech, there are tech nonprofits, but running a real-time communications platform at the scale we do as a nonprofit is like, a fish with legs in this industry. But we have to be a nonprofit, and this is really we have to resist the current business model and do something that is incredibly expensive. It costs about $50 million a year, $50 million a year, to run and maintain Signal. And any of the tech people in this room are like, you are so lean. And all the nonprofit and like regular folks, like where I come from, are like, what? Are you crazy? But that's the reality of tech. These are extremely expensive, which means they're also extremely profitable. And how is that profit made? I'll get into some of the history here because there's actually some really key decisions that sort of set us up for this pathological business model. But first, the truth of it is that the business model of tech, then and now, add all the AI you want, is monetizing data. So it's surveillance. It's a surveillance business model. You collect and create data about people, and whether that's through your engagement-driven social media platform or other mechanisms of creating and collecting data about people and things, you then use that data to model types of people or demographics, and you sell access to those types of people to advertisers and others who want to reach them, right? That's it. And then on top of that, you can use that data to train AI models, and then you sort of use those AI models for different purposes, but ultimately it all runs on either you monetize data or you provide hardware and goods and services to those who do. So what would that mean for something like Signal, which is laser focused on resisting that kind of surveillance, on collecting as close to zero data as possible in an environment where everything is built to enable collecting huge amounts of data? If we were a for-profit, what that would mean is, I don't know, in 13 seconds after we launch, I would have a board member go to Davos and have a conversation with some guy around like AI. We wouldn't be bringing in our revenue goals, right? We wouldn't, the business model isn't really working to preserve privacy as a first order objective. And we would be pressured from investors, from board members, from people whose fiduciary duty was profit above and beyond anything else, to get that revenue coming in, to undermine privacy a little bit. Just, maybe you'll do some homomorphic encryption. Well, it's a little too computationally expensive, but like, we'll do a little bit of it and we'll still call it private, and then the rest of it's gonna use a TE, sorry if I'm using whatever. We're gonna like rig something that looks kind of private but actually isn't, right? Like, WhatsApp for business or what have you. And then we're gonna get that money rolling in, because the way you make money in this industry is to do the thing Signal is not doing. And that helps explain why we have to be a nonprofit or another type of form that is actually resisting the particular incentives that characterize the profit motive in tech. And it also explains why there are so few actually private services, why tech looks the way it looks, why this industry has been able to claim so much epistemic control, which is a fancy academic word for like, they have claimed the right to write our stories and map our world for us with more authority than we have. Because at the center of this is this sort of, surveillance. Collect all the data and then sell people access to the knowledge you have, whether that's demographics or AI or what have you, with that data. And Signal exists to not do that, to preserve the right to truly private communication, which has been the norm for hundreds of thousands of years, in an age where almost every element of our lives and social relationships are being surveilled and mapped and monetized in one way or another. And so we couldn't do what we do if we were subjecting ourselves to a for-profit model. Not, this is not an indictment of a for-profit model, or, it doesn't have to be, right? What it is saying the particular incentives in this industry are so broken that we're not able to do privacy and generate profit at the same time. And that's, that if we're talking about a radical tectonic shift, that's the thing that needs to radically shift.
I knew about that. I love about that, but I thought that it was the most important things to get because it's not discussed enough.
Yeah.
The business model behind the Signal is as important as the product itself, in my point of view.
I totally agree. And I think I often hear people wanting to innovate, like we need to innovate new forms of tech. We need to innovate on privacy. You know, let's put more money into, you know, zero knowledge proofs. Let's put more money into this. Let's put, you know, like, and my answer is similar to yours probably. And I'm like, let's innovate on the business model. Can we get like as much energy needs to be going into that, into how do we create an ecosystem-wide approach and not let Signal be the exception that proves the rule? Because that's not safe or sustainable.
Yep.
But it's not, you know, having the technology does not in and of itself give us the power to deploy it in a way that is meaningful to us.
And charity is not a business model.
Exactly.
So, I've got so many questions, but we do not have enough time, unfortunately. I had questions about Microsoft REGOLE because I loved the middle finger you gave to Microsoft when they started the application, but we will not talk about that.
I want to give a shout out to my colleague Josh Lund, who's our senior technologist, who was the person who clocked that and then did so much work with our desktop team to figure out how do we stop Microsoft Recall, this new AI bot that was screenshotting every number of seconds your desktop in order to be able to use those screenshots as data. So when you asked the bot, what was I doing on my desktop, it would know. And of course, what runs on your desktop is Signal Desktop. And so this was creating a database on your desktop of screenshots of your Signal messages with no way for us as developers to turn it off. And so my colleagues searched through this code, found a DRM, which is the, you know, the thing that lets you not download music or share, you know, like the digital rights management, found a flag we could use to block screenshots to continue protecting privacy from this AI land grab that Microsoft was kind of the sloppiest on, but ultimately it's happening across the board and is... To Josh.
I've got a last question, that is, Signal was caught in the middle of a PR scandal a couple of months ago because it was thought to be the software used by American secrets, NSA, it wasn't NSA, it was...
Pete Hegseth, Mike Walls, and a number of people from the administration.
And, but it wasn't Signal itself. It was a rendition of the software made by another company, thought to be. No, okay.
Yeah, it was a fork of Signal. My reaction there is just like, you know, like you wake up and you're like, oh, a train hit my house. Okay. And now suddenly my house is part of the story, but, you know.
Yeah. But the question is, shouldn't every single nation develop something like Signal-alike for their sovereignty, or not? Because we are smiling because we know the part in which we are, but it's a real discussion happening. Do I need a real secure method of communication that is unbreakable by default, even by us, even by the good guys, or we need a United States proof Signal version that was the one broken, by the way, to just comply with laws and norms, etc.
Well, I mean, so what happened was I woke up on a morning and then there was this Atlantic story I had to read twice about war planning on a Signal thread that added a journalist, and I was like, really? Really? And the thing that I didn't clock is that it would be the main character for the entire week. And I would not sleep, and I would be up night after night with my lovely team, you know, calling journalists, explaining the difference between not authorized for classified use and has a vulnerability, you know, these kind of key things. And what we also didn't realize is that, you know, so what was apparently happening was we produce Signal. Signal is open source. That means you can go into our code repositories, you can look at all the code, and you do not have to trust me. It's really important that you don't just take my word for it. To me, I'm good at talking. I can get up here. I can be convincing. But do not take my word for it. You can go into the code base and you can validate that what my claims are around privacy, around robustness, around the behavior of Signal are actually true, because we make that open for people to see. And we make that open for people to reuse if they want to take that code and run it elsewhere. So they were using a version of Signal that had taken that code, was running it elsewhere, and that effectively put in a backdoor in order to archive all those messages for government compliance purposes. And the thing about a backdoor is, there's a lot of political issues where it's like, let's find the middle ground. And that's a very comfortable place for politicians and policymakers. There's no middle ground here. It's like sticky math. Either the system, Signal in this case, is, as we build it and design it, secure and private for everyone. That means you've got to picture the person you hate the most in the world. It's got to work for them. Because if it doesn't work for them, it's not going to work for the people you love the most in the world, the human rights workers, the journalists, the people for whom private communication is life or death. That's just the truth of it. If you put a backdoor in that, if you undermine the encryption, if you bolt on some sort of archiving database and move the target from encryption to like a WordPress vector, something absurd in this case, then what you have done is effectively undermine it for everyone. And so that's what they were using, and that gets into this question of like, how do we have a magical key? How do we have it both ways? We want security, but we want compliance, right? And ultimately, there isn't a way to have the type of robust privacy unless it is truly private for everyone. And we can get into, should states build this? I think ultimately digital communication crosses jurisdictional boundaries, it crosses institutional boundaries, it crosses, it's feral. It maps to human relationships, not to titles or institutions or jobs or states or nationalities or ethnicities. It's who you know that you need to talk to. So you couldn't have just a US version of Signal that's only available to US people and have it be useful at all. One of the reasons the global reach of these communication platforms is so compelling and so sticky is because it reflects the way relationships move across the globe. So I can get on Signal, I can text anyone, call anyone on Signal in the world, assuming their country isn't blocking it, and that call goes through. If I was using US Signal, it wouldn't. And so these, again, it has to work everywhere for everyone, or it doesn't really work for anyone and serve the purpose that we built it for.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Last question. FPS2025 is about European autonomy, all these people assembled. So if you just had a magic wand and would be able to
I know that sound.
just pass one immediate action to the European Parliament, which would that be?
Well, look, I think a lot of the regulations are in place already. So I'm going to do two because I'm going to be a little unruly here. The first would be even a conservative reading of GDPR could significantly reduce the surveillance business model's power, right? Could be used to ban surveillance advertising. That's, a conservative reading, right? That's not a, radical reinterpretation of the text. So I think that's really worth exploring, and I can get into why, but ultimately the concentration of power, infrastructural and data, is built on the backs of this business model. And there is no way of competing with this, whether you are another company based in California or a state based anywhere else, without understanding that you cannot compete on the terms they set. There's no way to roll your own new monopoly. That ground is salted. That network effect is established. Those terms have been written and rewritten. The standards are owned. The tool chains, the libraries, the paradigms, the pedagogy is, inoculated with this common sense. And so I think there's also an admonition that I would make, like, figure out the rules of the game that actually support a society you want to live in and begin to set those rules. Say, we're not coming to your party, we're throwing a way better party. And ultimately, all the cool people are going to be over here pretty soon because, you know, the food is good, the healthcare works, whatever it is, right? But I think that paradigm shift of like, why don't we have our own meta is not actually going to serve anyone. It's going to be continually, you know, like producing this type of like agitated shame in politicians who wish they'd invested early. But it's not getting you anything close to sovereignty or technology that is actually innovative, exciting, and capable of producing a world we want to live in.
Thank you so much. Meredith Whittaker.
Thank you.
Domande. Oh, perfetto. C'ho una valletta o faccio io la valletta che vado avanti e indietro? Il valletto. Grazie, signor Valletto.
Wow. Is this on?
Yep.
Yeah. So thank you so much for this opportunity. Like, I really appreciate this. It's a special moment even for me. So I'm not a tech guy, but when I realized that in the States people don't really use WhatsApp, I was shocked because I grew up in Italy. We mostly use WhatsApp. And I felt a bit dumb because I was like, okay, but why are we giving this strategic asset to the States, an asset that also made them even close an eye to the, I mean, when it comes to antitrust, to Meta's acquisition. And then I downloaded Signal after I read this article with which like they said that even they instructed EU officials to use Signal instead. So I was like, if they tell them to do that, maybe it's wise. So I used it for a while, but that was short-lived. I was the only one using it, so I felt lonely a bit. Yeah. And so my question is, now we know it's the coolest messenger app we have, but what's preventing us from using it? And do you want us to use that?
Thank you for that question. I mean, you framed out a really beautiful answer there with that experience, right? Like, let's be real with each other for a second. I love Signal. I use Signal. I demand people use Signal, but I also have a WhatsApp account. Because ultimately, I am using a messaging service because I want to talk to people I like, love, work with, know, and am group chats with. I'm not using it because I want to use an app. I don't want to think about an app. I want an app to respect me in my relationships, but like, we are here because we are social beings who want to talk to each other, who want to be invited to the party, who want to, you know, be in community in this life we have. We're not here because we want to symbolize who we are through our app usage. And so what's hard about that is that ultimately we're always going to choose our friends, our belonging, you know, the person we love, over being a staunch advocate for a tech product, even if the tech product is so cool like Signal. Now, what we do see is that people do switch in groups. And they switch in groups, you know, in three, you know, we kind of have thought through this. There's three big ways that happens. One, there's a political instability, and we saw this. Ukraine is a great example. When Russia invaded Ukraine, Ukraine was, as measured by phone number country code, toward the bottom of user bases, it shot up to the top, right? A lot of people all at once were like, oh shit, this matters, and switched over to Signal. And then because they all switched at once, all their friends were on Signal, and so they're like, hey, you're here, let's party, right? We see it when institutions mandate Signal. So the EU is a great example. The European Commission in 2020 said use Signal. The FBI, after the Salt Typhoon hack, which was a catastrophic attack on US telecom infrastructure, said use Signal. You see, you know, kind of a massive switch. And then we see it in the context of what we call, pardon my French, my English, big tech fuck-ups. So this is when a competitor does something egregious and everyone was like, oh no. And so in 2021, WhatsApp changed its terms of service to say we're going to share data with Meta. And we were top of the App Store across 30 countries for 3 months. It toppled our servers. It was huge. So it is, you know, people do switch. And right now we're seeing our user base is growing because people are getting more and more nervous about such intimate data being stored on the servers of companies that are willing to blow in the political winds, to gain favor with whoever's in power. And this is very serious. There's, I think people are feeling like this is not an abstract thing. Privacy isn't a dry administrative fact about data or data flows. That happens to be part of it. But it's also the fact that there's a woman named Jessica Burgess who's right now living in prison. And she's living in prison because Meta turned over her DMs between her and her daughter in the state of Nebraska following the US Supreme Court's Dobbs decision that enabled Nebraska to criminalize access to reproductive health. And those DMs were key evidence that was used to convict her in that state. So this is not, this is not abstract, and I think more and more people are recognizing it's not abstract, and as their communities sort of hit one of these inflection points, you see people get, I'm very optimistic people will shift. We have, the Netherlands just shot up. We have more than half the population of Germany is on Signal as measured by country code. So people are becoming more and more sensitized. But I think, that is the real question, right? And I think the real answer is we choose our friends because we are, and that's the beautiful thing about human beings. But it also is why network effects are so sticky. And historically, we've had, state-regulated monopolies for telecommunications because we understood that stickiness and the fact that you couldn't have 18 different phone companies that couldn't interoperate with each other, but interoperability itself was sort of a monopolizing force, et cetera, et cetera. So, thank you.
Yes, thank you for the great speech. I would like to ask you a question about a risk I'm sensing, but I don't hear a lot of opinions about, so I would like to have your both opinion on this. What I want to say, I'm feeling a sense of convergence, of increasing uniformity. I mean, a song goes trending on TikTok and everyone worldwide sings in their head that same song. Or, for example, even words. Legit is becoming a super used word. Like even my sister, like 12 years old, she says in Italian, legit. And what I'm asking about AI is, do you think that AI will contribute to this increasing uniformity and convergence of thinking also? And I don't know if it's a risk you're sensing as well. If you do you think, where do you think the responsibility is?
That's a really astute question, thank you. And I absolutely see that as a risk. Homogenizing culture, homogenizing language, and not just homogenizing it through one or another average, but through the lens of the safe for work corporate culture of a very, very narrow demographic in Silicon Valley. And last week, I spent some time with a dear friend of mine who's living in rural Ethiopia right now. And she visited Paris where I was, and we spent a couple days together, and she was just, recounting her daily life and talking about how illegible to these surveillance systems so much of that daily life is, because it's a poor country. There aren't surveillance cameras collecting data that would train the models. There are customs and ways of making your life known and not known that don't map through that lens. And in some sense, I was kind of but sitting with that, right? Because there's a beauty in being illegible to these surveillance systems, to not being known by this AI, to not having that captured and extracted and then sort of interpreted back at you as, this is who you are and this is what you deserve. But there's also a real discomfort I have, and I share what you said around how, if it doesn't capture it, is then it not part of culture going forward if AI owns culture? Or if the sum total of intelligence in the universe only reflects Reddit comments, what happens to all these beautiful traditions? What happens to these relationships? What happens to sort of linguistic diversity and creativity and all of that? And I think it's such a core epistemic question around who gets to define us and how do we get the power to transform and create our own world, our own culture in the face of something that is claiming to be intelligent, claiming to be God, claiming to be authoritative, but is ultimately reflecting a very narrow image of the possible worlds we could create, and saying this is complete and total, and foreclosing so many of those pathways toward other versions of being, other ways of speaking, other ways of doing and knowing and communicating and building and being with each other. That was a great question.
Un'ultima, perché poi mi hanno detto che ai 15 devo chiudere. Quindi.
Very quick one. So how do you manage, like, you and your team, like, the pressure, moral pressure, ethical pressure about having developed such a platform that is so great for good people, but is also serving bad people that are using it in bad ways? So is it like a balance? I'm doing more good than bad, so it, at the end, is worth it? Or it's something else?
Well, I don't know that I feel that as a pressure. Like, I don't go to bed at night being like, oh man, pressure. You know, we do think about that a lot. And, you know, ultimately, like, there's some flip analogies I could make, like roads serve bad people driving cars and walking in good, you know, like where are we drawing the line between the deserved and the undeserved when we come to core infrastructure, right? Like water, should the water be untreated for the bad guy's house and then, you know, like nicely treated and safe for, you know, I don't know. It begins to get a little bit sticky, but I think, you know, there is a discourse around, you know, and it's been in the, you know, in and around tech since the 90s, and there's actually a really interesting history here that I spoke about at the NDSS symposium, that if you're interested in the history of the crypto wars and the attack on privacy and encryption in the context of the internet and kind of the tech industry, there's a lot of info there, but that's for the nerds. I'll stick to your question. I think, you know, a lot of what we do when we think about just, you know, how do we reduce the harm surface is basically how we think about it. Because ultimately, the fundamental right to privacy is under threat. We are surveilled in almost every area of our lives. There's never been more data available to law enforcement or anyone, frankly, than there is right now, right? There's a lot of ways to square that circle, but privacy is vanishingly short supply. But what we don't do is build social media features that increase that harm, right? We don't have a directory, so you can't go into Signal and look up a stranger and like find affinity groups of things, right? You have to meet somehow, you know, like, hey, and you exchange Signal contacts somehow, right? We don't allow you to go viral. We could gain a lot of engagement if we did, right? But we cap our group size at 1,000, so we don't have, you know, can't be this giant public, like, million-member group that's spreading whatever. Like Telegram, like WhatsApp, and we, you know, don't build things like channels or broadcast functions. And so there are a lot of ways when we think about how do we maintain this objective function of as much privacy and the ability to privately communicate in a world where that's really very difficult digitally. How do we do that? We think about what we don't do as well. And a lot of the commitment here manifests not in sort of code that you can see, it's code we never wrote. It's what we choose not to do, even though it's leaving engagement on the table, even though it would create, you know, user growth, even though it's really kind of part of the dance most tech companies dance to, we don't do that. So I think, you know, there's two answers. One is I think we need to trouble that, like, you know, what about the bad guys thing? Because it's often used as a very bad faith argument to undermine fundamental rights, even though when you look under the hood, there's a lot of things you could be doing to stop the bad guys that no one's funding, no one's resourcing, no one's doing. So why do you constantly come to my door when there's no evidence that encryption correlates with criminality? Whatever. And then the other side of that is how do you thoughtfully build a platform when you're trying to preserve fundamental rights but don't want to create a larger harm service. So.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We're finished.
So fun. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Meredith Whittaker.
So nice.